I always like to begin with gratitude. I would like to thank Dr. Phyllis Thompson for this opportunity to speak in this space. Also the women's study team, Heidi Marsh, Deline, and Anna, and also Allison, who is my office mate. And I see my colleagues are also on the call today supporting me, Dr. Keith Johnson and Kim Maturo. I absolutely enjoy working with them. They are just been a pleasure to work with. And also my dissertation chair is on the line, Dr. Nancy Gallivan. So I would like to thank her for being here, supporting me on today. And there are also many other friendly faces I see, colleagues that we work together with the conference. So thank you again for supporting me today in this space. Like Phyllis said, this is my dissertation research. And how I came across this topic was all the articles I was reading during the time of my dissertation were negative. It always focused on the negative. And when I talked to my chair, I said I wanted to do something that focused on the positive. So this is a portion of my research. And my topic today is supporting African American women college student leaders. And just a brief introduction, African American women have demonstrated remarkable resilience. They've doubled their college enrollment between 1971 and 2005. And they participated in college in comparison at a rapid rate. So over the past 30 years, African American women have been enrolling in college at surmountable rates. But even with that, scholars continue to highlight the negative outcomes instead of looking at how they persist and are resilient. Just a background to the problem, African American women occupy a uniquely intersecting space as members of a historically marginalized group. They're both women and also people of color. Scholars continue to show and focus on the negative outcomes, yet little research reveals the ways and reasons African American women display resilience and successfully persist. So my dissertation study examined the experiences of high-achieving, actively involved and well-adjusted African-American undergraduate women and college student leaders enrolled at predominantly white institutions in Arkansas. I utilized the multiple lenses of Black feminist thought, intersectionality, capabilities approach, and quality of life to inform and support my study, and also help us better examine ways to meet the needs of African-American women college student leaders. I hope a lot of these takeaways could also be applied to this predominantly white institution here. So just a little bit about the theoretical frameworks. Black feminist thought is a critical social theory that centers and validates the intersecting dimensions of race and gender. This theoretical framework combines both race and gender to understand the development of African American women and their experiences. Race is the foundation on which Black women's self-perception and collective collaboration as women were based. So basically, if Black women perceive themselves in positive ways, this perception would increase the likelihood of future success. Black feminist thought captures the ways African American women college student leaders effectively navigate their institutions while moving their experiences from margin to center. And given that this study focuses on African American women, the outcomes of this study also provide the rationale for using intersectionality. This study emphasizes that African American women college student leaders' experiences can't be solely looked through the lens of race or by comparing them to African American men or gender. And I like to use this as an example. So for African American women college student leaders, they can't simply be African American on Monday. They can't simply be a woman on Tuesday. There are all these things every day of the week. And so intersectionality was a great analysis tool in this study. And just also by looking at the intersectional analysis, we're able to see that the various components of identity are interlocking and overlapping. And just to go beyond, one of the issues or one of the problems with this, with some of the current research out there, they always compare Black and white. No one simply looked at African American women. So constructing my study utilized both Black feminist thought and intersectionality approach in order to kind of remedy those cultural deficit approaches. So basically saying that we've been remiss in the way we study African-American women in the past. Now, capabilities approach is a new framework. Like I stated in the beginning, my program was a leadership program, and capabilities approach was something that we used to kind of look at problems in Arkansas, looking at human development and well-being. So just to kind of slow down here, the capabilities approach is a theoretical framework that focuses on the potential people are able to do and be. The capabilities approach is not simply a theory of social justice, but a normative theory. So this approach is also holistic because it considers personal, social, and environmental factors that have an impact on an individual's ability to exercise agency. So it is evident that African-American women college students utilize education to expand upon their human freedom. And of course, last but not least, quality of life. The educational levels achieved by African-American women directly affects the quality of life of the African-American community, the nation, and the nation's ability to compete globally. So understanding the experiences of African-American women college students allows us to directly create policies that impact institutional policies and programs that enhance the retention of these students. So those are the theoretical frameworks, but specifically the purpose of this study was to remedy the limited research available on high achieving African-American college students, specifically looking at high achieving African-American women. This study also enhanced the lack of research by looking at their out-of-class and leadership experiences. The study also provided a new perspective and challenged the deficit discourse and provided a counter-narrative. Basically, African-American women college student leaders have been studied wrong, and we apply more appropriate frameworks by using intersectionality and also Black feminist thought. So here is the conceptual framework used. Leadership identity development was the conceptual framework used in this study. Leadership identity development is critical outcome of higher education. It is very important that we understand the ways to foster this development from all racial and ethnic backgrounds. So this study used the voices and experiences of high achieving African-American women to examine the ways they perceive themselves as student leaders. So the central question of the research was, what are the lived experiences of successful, high achieving, actively involved, well-adjusted African-American women college student leaders? And for this study, I selected a methodology using the qualitative study, using a phenomenological approach to investigate the ways they perceived and internalized their experiences. I conducted a semi-structured interviews with 12 successful African-American women. I also used narrative inquiry and a phenomenological data analysis approach. 4 public institutions were used. All of them had the highest persistent rates in Arkansas. University of Central Arkansas was used, also Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, and then Arkansas Tech University in Russellville. So in order to be selected, the participants had at least 45 credit hours completed. They had a 3.0 GPA or higher. They were merit scholarship recipients, and they were actively involved leaders in at least 2 organizations. So after our IRB approval was granted at University of Central Arkansas, I basically was able to get in touch with 12 participants, get informed consent forms, and conduct one-on-one interviews with them at their campus's library. And the interview protocol was broken up into 8 different parts. All of the questions were broken up into these parts to answer the central question, which was, what are the lived experiences of these African-American women college student leaders? So the first part was Black feminist thought. The second part was intersectionality. The third part was capabilities, approach, and active involvement. Part 4 was academic experiences. Part 5 was social experiences. And part 6 was peer relationships. Part 7, faculty and staff relationships. And part 8, quality of life. So based on the participant demographics, all of these women were African American, confirmed taking advanced placement courses in high school. Sharon Friesbridge argues that African American students represent a various amount of backgrounds, and they enter college with a different set of life, familial, and educational experiences. As we can see from this chart, 6 participants grew up in homes with single parent families. Collectively, all 12 participants have been awarded merit scholarships. The mean college GPA for the 12 participants was 3.57. 11 participants expressed high educational and career aspirations, each indicating her intent to earn a terminal degree. And as you can see, the pseudonyms selected for the participants, all of these are women who were the first to attend a predominantly white institution, or they were the first to do something in their particular area. So that was how the participant demographic pseudonyms were selected. And basically the thematic categories were garnered through narrative inquiry. So from deep reading and careful review of the profile forms, thematic categories were identified. Each category followed by introductory phrases by the participants, and examples were pulled from the interviews. And this is the part I like, where we get directly into some of the experiences from the participants. So the first category talks about academic expectations, hesitations, and preparation. So this is from Lila Fenwick. She talked about how overall I felt I should have a good experience, but at the same time, honestly, I felt there were going to be obstacles. I was going to have to face being who I am, African American, at a predominantly white institution, of course. So here we see how intersectionality is a valuable lens, but how she pulled out recognizing the challenges that she would have to encounter based on who she was as an African American woman. This definitely captures the dual consciousness of African American women students and how they perceive their time on a campus. All of the women talked about how they knew they were going to be academically successful, but socially they struggled a bit on their predominantly white campus. One of the second thematic categories that was identified was representation. Representation is an important category in this study because it reiterates the importance of African American women's representation on a predominantly white campus. This representational intersectionality identifies the significance of participants performing racialized and gendered identities. So Katherine Johnson talked about being the only Black girl. My school is paid for, that's always a blessing. I applied for the honors college, and out of the 16 that applied, only 8 got it. I was the only Black girl that got it. So that was a nice reward in the honor society, and being able to say that I'm a part of that. It's really big in the math department. So representation was talked about a lot. That was one of the themes that came up from all 12 participants. And they talked about being standout students, standing out in their departments, standing out in the classroom, and also in their organization. So they talked about blatant tokenism, or being the only Black girl, and how, although it didn't seem to bother them, it kind of was fuel for them to be involved. African American women college student leaders shows that they accepted the challenge to speak up and have a voice on their campus. So a lot of times, being the only Black girl in their classroom or in the organization, they were forced to speak up. And Robinson coins the term spoke tokenism. This was something that came up a lot throughout the interviews with the students, just being a spoke token. And the next slide is talking about negotiating identities and defining images. Jane Bolin talked about being a Black female leader. And many of the participants had to negotiate multiple identities as being African American, female, and leader. And this came up a lot. A lot of them had positive self-identifications, like they identified with being resilient, being strong, but they also knew that they had to negotiate identities. That strong Black woman image, which is a historical image, a lot of them referred it back to that. So Jane Bolin said, so the person that made me feel most welcome and open that opportunity was absent. That made me realize that as a Black female, I had certain expectations and often had to perform better. I had to be just a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more assertive, but not as assertive because not to come off as intimidating. And the salience of this just shows back to participants' identity being susceptible to stereotypes and images. So that positive self-identification, but also having to perform in certain spaces with their leadership, having to perform their race. And so that was definitely one of the things that came out with negotiating identities, knowing when to have to speak up and then also knowing when to have a non-response. And involvement catalyst was another big thing. A lot of these women got involved because they wanted to make connections. They had a lot of different involvement catalysts. So Sadie Alexander talked about every organization here on campus, I'm pretty sure make you volunteer. Volunteering is a big thing here. I feel like with the extracurricular activities, it has set me up to volunteer in other places. And knowing when you volunteer other places, it sets you up for careers because of those people you know. You're getting your name out there in the way to build the committee, so it helps you way more. So in this, talking about the environment catalyst, a lot of the participants talked about wanting to get involved because they wanted to build community. They had career aspirations. They also wanted to make connections, but a lot of them had career aspirations. And in the beginning, I talked about how 11 of the participants had educational aspirations to get a terminal degree. Only one mentioned that she only wanted to get her master's in psychology. So these are the thematic categories definitely pointed out involvement catalysts. And benefits and opportunities. So when I was doing this study, I was thinking about, so what is it that these women experienced that was different from other college students? And I think one of the things that really stood out was study abroad opportunities. So these are high achieving African-American women college student leaders. So to have an African-American woman talk about her Fulbright program. So Eve Leaf talked about one of the benefits and opportunities was, yes, my Fulbright program. I really haven't even thought about it a lot. I know I received the Fulbright grant to go to Spain to teach English, like it still hasn't hit me yet. It definitely is a unique opportunity because I was the first one. So this was definitely something that really stood out because in previous literature, a lot of African-American women, it didn't talk about their study abroad opportunities, but to have her talk about it and to have this come out in the study was a great thing. And then of course, there are stressors of leadership and achievement. All of the participants talked about how they had to sacrifice their high GPAs, sleep, romantic relationships because of their leadership and active involvement. Mamie Clark talked about, I guess, high expectations from others. So if you fail, you kind of fail. Yeah, I would say high expectations. So many of them talked about how that had all eyes on them, and that was part of being a stressor of leadership and achievement. For some of it, it serves as an accountability measure, but for some of them, they felt like they had to maintain this public image because they were a student leader on campus. So, like I said, talking about the spoke token role, this goes back to that, and then the responsibility of representation and how a lot of them felt like they represented the entire race when they were a part of these professional organizations. And the last category that was identified was success strategies and support. These 12 African-American women college student leaders, they talked about how they leverage support from their academic programs, from their families, and all of them tapped into their spirituality for resilience and persistence. Eileen Southern talked about how God is responsible for my success. He is the one that gave me the passion, the gifts, and the education, the desire to want an education. I wouldn't be motivated without my faith. And then number two, being my parents. They have always encouraged me to do what I love. So just to highlight some advising styles and some strategies. Before I got here, I did serve as an academic advisor and also a first-year experience instructor. And one of the things that stood out was some of the advising styles and strategies that we need to do when we work with this particular population. And I talked about proactive advising. Proactive advising is when contact is initiated by the academic advisor rather than the student. And of course, all of these students talked about how their integrated identities. So as an advisor or a higher education professional and administrator, one must understand how this identity understands students from their integrated identity. They must also immediately connect African-American women to community through involvement and leadership, and acknowledge those stressors of leadership and achievement. I know when I was doing the interviews, I had a lot of the participants that really just talked about the stress of it. It was so hard to even get them scheduled for an interview with me because they were so on their time management, they were so busy. So making sure as higher education professionals, we use proactive advising styles. And then just to leave us with some things and just to discuss, if I could give us 5 takeaways from this talk and how we could best support African-American women college student leaders, it would have to be that African-American women college student leaders perceive their collegiate experiences through multiple identities. Administrators, when you want to connect, know that they're different from the traditional college student. Many of them face intersectional microaggressions daily. So we, as at the institution, we must intentionally support them and support their needs and development as African-American women early and directly. And then secondly, I will talk about the multiple sources of support and strategies. Nearly all of the participants discussed needing multiple identity programs, whether that was specific to their parental status, their gender, and student support service. These women leverage their support from peers, mentors, family members, and spirituality, but knowing that they need multiple sources of support and involvement. But I know we talk about involvement, especially for the traditional college student, but involvement is important for African-American women because it remedies the social isolation that they encounter and alienation that they often feel when they're on predominantly white institutions. And then of course, involvement and leadership is great for African-American college students. The stakes are higher for these women, so they have to be able to gain skills necessary so they can lead. And they talked about how they gained a level of gender and race consciousness from being able to get involved and also lead their various campus organizations. So it also helped them to remedy and to fight those stereotypes. And then of course, the last takeaway, the development of leadership skills. Development of leadership skills contribute to African-American women college student leaders being able to secure careers and leadership roles in all sectors of the workforce. So those are the 5 takeaways that I would want to leave. And since I do have a little bit of time, I'm going to talk about some of the unintended consequences. One of the things that came about from narrative inquiry was all of the participants talked about how I was the first one that set them down and actually asked them what was it that helped them be successful. And so just the fact that all of these women were high achieving through high school, they had been actively involved, their whole college career, I was the first person that was able to actually sit them down and ask them that. I think one of the other unintended consequences was empathy. The fact that I was another African-American woman, I was able to really get in tune with them and ask them questions, ask them some of those hard questions. I know two of my participants, they cried. It was just being able to actually talk to another African-American woman who was not too much older than them and just ask them about their experience. So I thought that was a part of the ethic of care, something that that we talk about a lot, but to actually see that and that empathy that came out, I thought was an amazing part of this experience. And then reciprocity. I think the fact that they all shared their story, at the end, I made sure that I shared my own story, letting them know where I was in that my process and where I was in my doctoral journey. So just to let them know that, hey, you're doing it, but keep doing it. And just them sharing their story, I think it helped me a lot more. It made me want to continue. It made me want to persist. It made me want to finish my degree at that time. And then another unintended consequence, I think it goes back to the multiplicity. All of these women had different stories, different backgrounds. And I think that goes back to show that the Black experience is not a monolithic experience. You can talk to 12 different African-American women and get something totally different out of it. But yet at the same time, there are some of those shared experiences that make it so great. And some of the implications and possibilities, and just kind of knowing, just from talking to these women, and that could be applied on our campus, is support. What would all of these African-American women be if they had all of that support? And if I am a student affairs professional or a faculty member on this campus, how can I provide these women with support immediately when they get on our campus? And then all of the participants worked. I think all of them worked with the exception of one. So what would it be like, or what would their experience be if they didn't have to work? If we had scholarships, if we had funding for these women to all be able to give their energies to their jobs, to their classwork, their leadership, their service, what would that be like? And also the participants all told me if they could change one thing, it would have been getting involved. A lot of them stated they didn't get involved until like the second semester or their sophomore year. They would have gotten involved earlier. And then last, of course, but not least, is self-care. I mean, when I tell you these participants were busy ladies, they were busy. I had a hard time getting in touch with them. They had schedules, calendars. They were booked and busy, like we like to say, but they all mentioned the need for better self-care. So when we know all of these things about our African-American women college student leaders, or just even about our African-American women on our campuses, how can we as professionals, how can we as students, faculty, and staff support them? These would be the things that I would also leave for us today. So again, thank you again for listening to my talk. Thank you, Dr. Thompson, for this opportunity to share my research, and I'm happy to stay on the line to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cooper. That there's so much. I know that everybody probably has questions. This has been such a rich talk, and there are so many avenues that we could explore. So let me open the floor. Heidi has unmuted you, and so you might need to use your cursor to just click unmute. But let me open the floor for questions. If you'd prefer to put your question in the chat, then I will ask it for you. But please feel invited to ask Dr. Cooper your question yourself.
Hi, Dr. Cooper. I have a question. So last year I took an intro to women's studies class, and we talked about kind of hierarchy of oppression and how there really is not one. But some African American women do feel like there is one. And so we had to do an interview. And so I chose to interview my aunt on my dad's side, who is a Black woman. And she is very successful. She's now the principal of a school that her mom could not even attend. So she, when I asked about being a woman and being Black, she really felt that she couldn't address the struggles of being a woman because the struggle of being Black was so much greater in her struggle. And I feel like recently I have felt similarly. So I've kind of put aside the struggle of being a woman because right now racial tensions are so heightened. And so I guess my question is, how can we use that intersectionality in supporting African American women when oftentimes African American women don't recognize the intersectionality themselves?
Great question, Keandra. I think, and just going back to my research, in all the participant interviews, all of them talked about how race was a big factor. So normally, even when they were interacting in the classroom, when they were leading their student organizations, race was more salient than being a woman. So I think when you apply the intersectionality approach and thinking about it, you can't separate those things. And I think a lot of times we don't think about that as women, how race is going to be more of something that's going to stand out a lot more. But I think that goes back to say why intersectionality was so appropriate for this, because a lot of times when you look at research or when you have conversations, people want to separate them, and you can't. Race and gender are always interacting, interlocking at the same time. Like I said, you can't just be an African American on Monday and then change and be a woman on Wednesday. You're all those things every day.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat box from Miss Lewis, and she asks, do you think faculty and advisors could use your research to help other minorities, American Indian, Hispanic, Asian, going to a PWI succeed?
I think a lot of the information that I read and provided, it could be applied to African American women. But I also think anytime you work with students of color, and you can apply a lot of those things. But I do think some of those frameworks like intersectionality could be applied. Specific to Hispanic, there's a lot of great research out there about helping Hispanic
Cuddly wait time to make sure that you have opportunity to ask your question.
Hi, Chassidy. I had a quick question. I'm interested to know if any of your participants compared their experiences on their campus in leadership positions to experiences that they've had in organizations off campus in leadership positions that may or may not take place in predominantly white spaces.
So that's a great question, Heidi. One of the things I would like to do is further research. So I did this research back in 2017, is to kind of get back with those same students in 5 years and see where they are. I would definitely like to see what their experiences are now. Many of them were not just actively involved in student organizations on campus. Many of them were also involved in church organizations. They were involved in their community. So they talked about how a lot of those experiences were different when they were in what I like to say, not mainstream organizations on campus or predominantly white, but when they were in more community organizations, when they were a lot of times from areas where there was more Black people. So their experiences were definitely different when they worked with community and church groups.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Cooper. I was really interested in your comment about that so many of your participants said or expressed that they had never been asked their story. And so I just wondered if you were surprised by that, or what do you think is behind that, or how can we learn from that, that piece of information that you uncovered?
Great question. Thinking back on it, I think that question goes back to why African American women are understudied in the literature. Oftentimes, we don't ask the question. And so I'm not always seen, or my leadership role isn't always prevalent, sometimes people don't know what I'm actually doing. So I think that goes back to the point that they've been understudied. But I think it provides a kind of a way for us to get involved. Ask our students what they're doing. How are you being successful? Not always what issues of maladjustment or being negative, like, are you having a hard time? What are you doing that's successful, and how can I share this with other students on campus? So that was kind of the whole premise of why I wanted to do this study, is because I wanted to point these young ladies in a positive light. And a lot of times we do that just by sharing our story.
Thank you.
Hi, Chassidy, it's Stacy. I really enjoyed your talk. This research is so important, and I really get a lot from hearing stories and qualitative research. I'm wondering the themes that came out, does it, I guess, give you some insight on what we could be doing differently at ETSU, or ways that we can provide further opportunities, I guess, in the spirit of what Donna had brought up too, about sharing stories, asking people about stories. I guess that's one way to support, but ways that, are there things that come up for you that we could be getting closer to what is making people successful?
Thank you, Stacy, for your question. And Dr. Johnson is on the line, and so I'm going to have to plug his strategic plan. One of the things that came out is representation. And I think when students see themselves in the classroom, when they see themselves, in leadership positions, they have more of an idea of what they can be. And I think just increasing the number of students of color here, but when you increase the number of students of color here, you also have to have faculty and staff to support them, support their needs and their development. I can say from my own personal experience, just seeing Mary Jordan, when I got here, seeing Angela Lewis, that showed me what I could be and what I could do. If it hadn't been for Mary Jordan and a lot of those programs, I wouldn't be here. So I think we have to do those same things for the students after us. So increase the number of faculty and staff of color so you can support the needs and development of the students of color when they do come to campus. And I'm looking at all of your faces trying to see if people are about to jump in for a question.
Dr. Cooper, I was really, your ideas about proactive and advising, I found just incredibly compelling, particularly around integrated identity and connection to community, and then acknowledging stressors, speaking of, Stacy's right here, the uncomfortable conversations, which is one of the things that you were talking about and led the discussion on during the Equity and Inclusion Conference. And then I was also struck that you were talking about that the women that you interviewed said one of the things that they said most often is they wish they could have gotten involved sooner. to have that connection with other people and those opportunities for mentoring. So kind of following up on Stacy's question, what would be some things that we could offer students, you know, during the freshman orientation, that first week that they are here on campus, to help them get involved earlier and to make that invitation and make it seem authentic and real and invite students in?
Thank you, Phyllis. That's a great question. I think and I can even take that question from being a new person coming in March during COVID. And one of the things, even for a faculty, staff, or student, is connect them to resources early. I was very fortunate that Sarone Foster was one of those people. She pointed me to the hairdresser. And that can seem like something very small, but that is very big for an African-American woman. Pointing you to, you know, introducing me to different people. So for students, making sure that they know where the Multicultural Center is, making sure that they know who to connect with when they immediately get on campus. Those are some of the things that you could already, as a faculty member or staff person, know that this particular person needs to get involved early. So how can I connect them to resources? How can I connect them to another good person? I see you have this interest in the gospel choir, so let me connect you to Ms. Laura Terry. Or you want a major or minor in women's studies, let me connect you to Phyllis Thompson. So making sure you're doing those things early and not afraid to do it. Just be very intentional about how you're trying to support them at that time.
I'm not sure I have a question, but I want to make some comments. I think this is research is great. I think when you talk about being intentional, we need to be intentional with students. At least that was always my always what my plan was. And I guess because we connect with students coming in at different points, how do we make sure that we have a coordinated effort, I guess is what I'm trying to say, so that we are taking opportunities as students come in at various points to help them get connected and get involved, and to work with those faculty and staff that have these different groups of students over the type of research that you've done. That for me was always an area that I struggled with in terms of how we make those connections, how we connect the dots, so that people don't fall through the crack, that are really could potentially be great leaders, and that we aren't giving them the things that we need early on. And I don't know if that's a question. You might want to respond. I don't know if that's a question. I really was making some comments.
And I think it's a great question, and it's probably something that I'll have to answer again better next year. And I'm glad that you asked the question, because I probably need to have a meeting with you to talk about it a little bit more. But one of the things that I have noticed just being on campus is a lot of the people who are involved, who are diversity champions, or who already are doing this work, they've been doing this work for a long time. But there are also people here who are passionate about it, who want to get involved, but are just not sure how to get involved. So I think that's something that you have to have a lot of conversations. That's a lot of coffee meetings, you know, being socially distanced, and getting those people involved and making sure that they're plugged into the right areas. And I think a start is inclusive excellence training. That's something that we could start. You know, I think the conference was great on the last week, but it's going to take a lot more connections and asking those hard questions of what we can really do to get people involved. And I think that's something that we'll have to talk about, and I probably won't know that answer just yet. So we probably need to have another conversation offline.
I wanted to direct your attention to Dr. Williams' point in the chat, that just in case you're not seeing the chat, she writes that she thinks that Mary's question point was really great. I also think specifically about graduate students who may not have had as many opportunities to hear about ways to get connected. So. Do you see working with graduate students differently from undergraduates or faculty and staff?
I think graduate students basically, they have a perfect opportunity to get involved. I know the Black Faculty Staff Association is something that we're trying to revitalize and get started, but there are also other organizations for graduate students to get involved. And graduate students are great here because they can not only benefit from mentorship from faculty and staff, but they could also serve as mentors and role models to students. I know Justin Guillory, and I don't know if he's still on the line. He's a graduate student here, an African-American male. And I was just thinking about, here he has had a lot of opportunity to speak, to be involved on conferences, but what if there was an African-American male initiative program? He could head up and be a part of that, but he could also give his leadership expertise to students. He's already graduated from ETSU. So a lot of those spaces, you have to think about our graduate students as not as leaders of the future, but they're leaders now.
I was waiting to see if there might be any burning comments or questions. Well, let me take this opportunity to thank Dr. Cooper for her willingness to share her research and the work that she has been doing, particularly with such an incredibly busy schedule in the Office of Equity and Inclusion, having just closed the second annual conference and getting ready for a Cultural Competency Institute in the weeks ahead, and already starting to plan a new conference for next year. We're grateful for your presence on this campus. Dr. Gallivan, I see you are here. Thank you so much. This is Dr. Cooper's mentor and dissertation professor from Arkansas. We welcome you and are so glad that to have you at ETSU virtually today. But Dr. Cooper, thank you again. Next month, same time, same place, Dr. Rachel Miller-Slow from the Department of Psychology will be here talking about emotional socialization implications for youth psychosocial adjustment. And so that'll be the first Wednesday in November. So we hope you can join us again then. But a big round of applause for Dr. Cooper. Thank you all. See you next month.